All right, it's 10:15. Are you ready? We're ready. Well, good morning. Welcome to Push-Pull Partner Content Strategies for Community Engagement. My name is Alex Bordelot. I'm content strategist at the Minneapolis Institute of Art.
And I'm Gretchen Halverson, Manager of Digital Engagement and Access at Minneapolis Institute of Art as well. We'd like to first welcome you to the session by acknowledging that the land on which our community gathers today is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. We want to pay respect to the citizens of the Kumeyaay Nation, both past and present, and their continuing relationship with their ancestral lands.
And can you all hear us pretty well? Great, okay. And as representatives of MIA, we would also like to respectfully acknowledge that the land on which MIA resides is Dakota Makoche, the Dakota homeland, and we acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the recorded people of this region, the Anishinaabeg, the Ho-Chunk, and the Oceti-Sakowin, or the Seven Council Fires. We also acknowledge that those who are unrecorded since time immemorial, and we strive for respectful relationships with all the peoples of this land in the search for collective healing and true reconciliation. As settlers on occupied lands, we are grateful for the opportunity to learn, unlearn, and relearn our ways of knowing today and henceforth with all of you. Okay, so our presentation is going to be around partnerships with community partners where digital is implied or is part of that practice. And we'll be presenting two different case studies and then kind of reflect on some big takeaways. We thought we would kind of, oops, I got the wrong page here. We thought we would kind of get grounded by just referring back to our strategic plan, which was written in 2016 and just updated this year. And there are kind of two lodestars around which we kind of orbit, especially when we think about the work that Gretchen and I do, as well as many of our coworkers. And those relate to visitor-related content which is truly puts the visitor at the center of the experience and content creation so that the visitors feel inspired to generate their own meanings and to question what they see. And then secondly, within the strategic plan is a real mandate towards rethinking the types of relationships that we want to develop with our communities, and kind of fully acknowledges that in the past, those relationships have been transactional in nature, kind of predicated upon, well, if you do this for us, we'll do this for you, and that sort of thing, and thinking that, you know, this has not been a very functional approach in the past, and looking to change that. So all of which is to say that the work that we do as a staff at MIA kind of has this broad mandate to put the visitor at the center of what we do, and then also to think about visitors and people who frankly don't visit yet, and perhaps won't in the near-term future as actual real partners in what we do at the museum. And so today, as I said before, we'll kind of think about how this has impacted the work that we do in digital.
So of course, connecting with community and sort of shifting how that relationship operates is, easy and wonderfully written in our strategic plan, but certainly harder to implement in practice. So we wanted to really kind of think about how it is that we connect with our community, and we all know that technology is a really great tool to connect each other with our friends, our family, and in this case, our visitors. So wanting to really think about how we can use digital as a tool to connect with our community. We've established best practices and guidelines for writing for digital platforms, for ensuring that it's an engaged kind of model. However, that sort of those guidelines are really, predicated on this notion that we produce content and we, send it out to folks. We put a label on the wall, and so this sort of model of just broadcasting our messages, certainly with a lot of forethought, but not necessarily in collaboration with our community. So wanting to really kind of think about how we position our audience and visitors as not only sort of consumers of our information and our art, but also how can they actually be actual collaborators in the creation of that content. And what does inclusive digital interpretation look like as a process, and emphasizing process, which we'll get into, but also as the end product as well.
So all credit goes to Gretchen for coming up with the words push-pull partner. We've been thinking about how we can talk about some of our work and how we can reflect upon it through this kind of I don't know, model or filter of push-pull partner, and kind of, in all transparency, our museum, MIA, has been really involved in a kind of movement called Museum as Site for Social Action or Mass Action, and a lot of our thinking is very much informed by other thought leaders in our industry. Push-pull partner, and the words we're going to use derive immensely from an essay by Christine Lashaw and Evelyn Arantes called Sharing Authority, Creating Content and Experiences. It's actually chapter 6 in the Mass Action Handbook. If you're unfamiliar with this resource, it's freely available as a downloadable PDF at www.museumaction.org. I highly recommend that essay as well as all of them. I think it'll be really, it shows us the future. Okay, so Gretchen kind of touched on this already, but the kind of traditional method of content creation and distribution is this kind of push model or broadcast model. We museum workers create content through traditional modes of intellectual and creative production, such as academic research, standardized museum education practices, et cetera, and the public is really seen as kind of an end user or consumer of those products.
The other sort of model in which we often communicate is by pulling information from our community members. So we may have an event or exhibition that we're planning, and we reach out to community members as a means to sort of shape the end product, but really that product and the contributions of community members is also often filtered through the lens of the museum. So it sort of goes through this chain. While it might involve community, what actually ends up on the walls is really most likely has been created specifically and authored by the museum itself.
Yeah. So kind of like selectively solicited input. Which brings us to, kind of the holy grail for us, which is, a true partnership. And so, we define that as community members and museum staff develop a product together. What does this look like in kind of real terms? Well, basically the project is defined not simply by the museum, and then we look for a partner. In fact, we build relationships with community partners and then work together on defining that product, or I should say that project. And decisions and ideas are created jointly, and that, and this is kind of key, that, if there is a finished product, that community voices are very much apparent in the final outcomes.
And I would also emphasize sort of authority is shared in terms of decision-making power as well.
And there should be cats.
Yeah.
Oh, come on, that was a joke. Okay. Thank you. All right.
Always cats. So starting with one of the case studies for us was a project we were reinstalling a gallery dedicated to Buddhism. The gallery reinstallation was a collaborative process internally, but we realized that we really wanted to understand what our public thought about Buddhism, what they wanted to know, what they were curious about, and wanted to make sure that the gallery really was informed by those perspectives. We were also mounting a larger exhibition on Buddhism in the coming years, and so wanted to use this as a sort of pilot for reaching out to community in a specific way. We leveraged a tool called Hearken. Hearken is an online platform that is primarily used by news organizations to really ask their public what they're curious about, what questions they have, what news stories they might want to have that organization look into. It acts as a sort of module for which, a sort of embedded module that can be placed on any sort of website or into social media posts so that it seeds questions, it gathers those questions, and those questions can then kind of be manipulated, can be coded, can be responded to in a really robust way. That's what the tool Hearken is really great at. It's great at sort of synthesizing all of these questions so that your organization is able to listen to those questions and then hopefully create reciprocal relationships, which I'll get into in a little bit. These examples from NPR are really good in that they sort of demonstrate that they're listening to their public and want to actually get information about what they care about. They want their input, they want their responses. So this model seemed really, intriguing in the sense that we might actually be able to get direct questions from our visitors, and hopefully in a manner using technology that would help kind of facilitate the conversation. So we had a team that I think in this case was really, we were lucky enough that we were able to collaborate with both our media and technology teams, for which I am a part of, our audience engagement, sort of social media, communication strategy, as well as curatorial affairs, so that we could connect with the experts in that field. In developing a communication strategy to really reach out to our audience and say, what are you curious about as it relates to Buddhism? What questions do you have about Buddhism? We took a couple different approaches to make sure we were able to gather that information in some specific ways. One of those was social media, so we were able to directly reach out to our social media followers and say, again, what questions do you have about Buddhism? We're doing this show. We really want to understand how you might want to engage with this exhibition, and we really want your input. The other method we took was sort of more directed communication with our affinity groups related to our Asian art collection. So folks that have already opted in, they're already sort of going to programming, they might be donating in a bigger way to those collection areas, and so wanted to make sure we were engaging that group too, because we knew they were engaged and we knew they'd probably be a reliable partner and actually offering some input. I think these two different approaches, one kind of reaching out to maybe like the super fans as it relates to the email correspondence, but then also reaching out to our sort of maybe just general super fans of the institution, not necessarily our Asian art collection. So having this sort of two-pronged approach. We also had the opportunity to ask folks while they were in the gallery itself. So prompting with an iPad and this sort of cube to say, do you have questions about Buddhism? And having folks actually ask a question while they were on the iPad in the gallery. And then we were also able to display the answers that our curator was able to provide to those questions that were asked. So I'll get into that. We had a really wide range of questions that were asked of our curator, and for example, this very kind of sophisticated question about Buddhism. It reads, in the Buddhist faith, is there a belief or differentiation between a heaven and a hell as dominated in the Christian faith? So it feels like a pretty, they seem pretty interested in how this might pan out. And our curator was able to answer the question from Catherine and sort of really get into the nitty-gritty of this, noting the ways in which heaven and hell play prominent roles in the Buddhism practice. We also had some more general questions like, where do Buddhas come from? We were able to answer this question too, noting from our curator that sort of depends on who you ask. The term Buddha is a title that describes an awakened being and goes on to sort of really dig into that question a little bit more. Again, really directly engaging with young. And I should note that as these questions come in and as folks submit them, they were also really prompted and encouraged to add their email address and their contact information, name, and email was kind of the primary information we were looking for so that we could reach out directly to them. So as those questions came in and we were able to answer them, having that really direct sort of, I would say email is a little kind of an intimate moment, I think, for us to be able to really reach out directly from the institution to that person who asked the question. We also had fun questions like this: when will I get a girlfriend? I think probably Ka maybe didn't necessarily anticipate an answer back, but we really wanted to be able to engage with our visitor no matter the sort of level of question. And in this case, our curator, Erin, was able to respond with a really wonderful essay or sort of response about the role of love in Buddhism. So again, I think that, we were able to engage in a sort of really sophisticated manner in terms of some of these questions and really provide a nice response. But I would also argue that that question in response to when will I get a girlfriend was equally sophisticated and perhaps a really wonderful moment to delight that visitor. Again, we wanted to demonstrate that we were actually making that connection. We weren't sort of just taking in these questions and not having, it was sort of a bottomless pit of questions, not necessarily getting answered. So we were then, our sort of second communication strategy was then to push those answers out. So you asked and we answered, demonstrating our commitment to our visitor and really responding to the questions that they might have. So overall outcomes, we had 24 questions asked and answered over the course of about a month, maybe a couple weeks that we were embarking on this pilot. In the email communication that we sent out, we really had higher than average open and click rate through in that email than our normal emails. The time spent on the site, both where the questions were answered and also where you could input your own question, was four times the average in terms of dwell time on that site. And we were ultimately able to have that really direct communication with our visitors. Again, I think it's interesting to think about email or social media being a direct connection, but I think it's important to actually acknowledge that that really can be a positive tool. It doesn't necessarily have to be this really deep discussion, although Alex will get into how that can work too. So did this actually really impact that installation in our Buddhist gallery? I think it did. I think it was, as our curator was having to read through these questions, as our interpretive planners were having to really see the questions and the types of questions that were being asked, I think it definitely folded into the way our interpretation ended up on the wall. So that interpretive scaffolding was really informed by those types of questions, often impacting the assets that were produced, like this map. How can we demonstrate the spread of Buddhism? It also impacted a digital component we had in the gallery, which is our digital map, we really provided a sort of Buddhism 101 in this digital format. Who was Siddhartha? What is his story? How had Buddhism developed? And then demonstrating the breadth of our collection and that spread of Buddhism, which was the real kind of key message we were trying to demonstrate within that gallery. And finally, as I mentioned, we were mounting a larger exhibition dedicated to Buddhism, which is forthcoming, and we held a symposium dedicated to developing content and developing perspectives on how we should approach that exhibition. And this small little pilot was certainly still able to inform how those conversations unfolded, and I think probably the breadth and scope of how folks were thinking about that exhibition and how it might unfold.
Thanks, Gretchen. So I'm going to talk about a very different type of project that involved a different structure and a different partner. And this was a digital exhibition on the arts of Somalia that we had planned to produce in timing with a physical exhibition of the arts of Islamic Africa. The exhibition, and by extension this project, had been funded by a NEH planning grant, and then we ultimately also received an implementation grant, and for various reasons that I'll get to, we kind of had to do a hard stop on both projects at some point. So this is kind of not a really cautionary tale, but a useful example of where we didn't actually meet our stated goals, but we learned a lot along the way. Some of you may know, but many of you may not, that the Twin Cities is home to one of the largest communities of Somali expatriates in North America. We value this community immensely. In some ways, the Twin Cities are surprisingly diverse, and which we welcome and see enormous value in. And my phone's ringing. Sorry about that, everyone. At any rate, I think it's Doctors Without Borders, actually, which is kind of cool. So we've always been very interested in partnering with this community and have been looking for ways to do so. And this was one opportunity that we really felt like, well, if we don't do it now, when are we going to do it? And so what we came up with is, with our partners, I'll talk about in a second, a kind of community-based and very collaborative knowledge creation and curation process that would essentially be based in intergenerational dialogues between young Somali Americans and their elders about kind of cultural heritage. We had a couple really compelling models upon which to build, upon which to think about our own project, and I'll just name those in case you're interested in looking them up later. One is called GRACEAC, which is an acronym for the Great Lakes Research Alliance for the Study of Aboriginal Arts and Culture. It's largely based out of Canada. Another one is SierraLeoneHeritage.org, and in both cases, it's a It's a collaborative of traditionally trained academics as well as keepers of knowledge from indigenous communities, keepers of expertise, in combination with collections of material culture, artworks, artifacts that are from museums, collections, and other types of collections, both kind of in Canada and North America generally, as well as elsewhere in the world. So kind of in a way, a digital aggregation of a diaspora of objects and a group of individuals who in combination create a basis of knowledge around those objects and those cultures. And our project similarly sought to reconnect objects, both within MIA's collection as well as within museums worldwide, with our local Somali American community as a kind of conversation starter to get into questions about material culture and cultural heritage more generally. It was a two-phase project, and I have to kind of say outright that we did not create this roadmap at the beginning. This is kind of a retrospectively created roadmap. I wish we had done this at the start. It would have made things clearer for all of us. But this gives you a sense of the overall structure and the ways in which we sought to partner with organizations as well as communities. Phase one started in 2014 and ran through 2015. This was a partnership between our museum as well as the University of Minnesota and Somali students at the University of Minnesota and elders to whom we reached out. Just a note that this is the Somali flag. It's a blue field with a white star. That's there to kind of represent Somali American communities and individuals in the Twin Cities. And so you can kind of walk through the different phases of this project and who was involved at those various stages. And the first part of the project was really an attempt to kind of develop a knowledge base through interviews that would then be turned into kind of compelling digital stories. And we'll talk about that, and we'll kind of see what that looks like in a second. The second phase began about a year after that, and that was a content development partnership between the museum and this really kind of compelling and dynamic new community-based museum called the Somali Museum of Minnesota. And in that case, the goal was to create kind of web-ready content that could be hosted on both of our websites. Okay, so phase one. The individuals that you see here, Vicky Koifman, Sido Mohammed, Saeed Ahmed, those are individuals who are all faculty and staff at the University of Minnesota. Jan-Ludwig Groters is our curator of African art at MIA. Those four people plus me were kind of the core team that really sought to structure this project, defining outcomes and so on. Basically what we decided to do was that we would kick this project off largely as kind of an undergraduate level course called Use of Oral Traditions as Resources for History. And in our planning process, we came up with the curriculum. There was going to be a practicum portion where students actually did interviews with elders. We co-developed a set of 43 Somali objects, as well as an interview protocol, and just kind of thought through the mechanics of how these conversations between elders and students would happen. And this is kind of what it looks like in a sort of more flowchart approach. We put together these notebooks full of pictures of objects that students would take with them, as well as digital recorders, to interview Somali elders who had been identified and signaled their willingness to participate in this project. We had over 20 interviews, so more than 20 hours worth of audio that then Sido and Saeed translated and transcribed, a massive amount of work, as you can imagine. And then it was kind of incumbent upon me to go through those transcribed interviews and, as proof of concept, kind of construct some digital stories, which is what you see on the right side of the screen. This was built in a platform that we had developed in-house for digital storytelling that was then called Griot. We've reconceived that now as an open source platform called Loom. If you're interested, Gretchen's the person to talk to about that. It's really great. There's a lot of opportunity there. At any rate, the desire really was to have those voices kind of come through in the end product in ways that make it very clear who's talking and whose ideas are being presented here. So I'll just read an example. One elder named Muhammad Hamid Omar said, "This is a luch, a slate to write on. Students of the Quran use it when learning. The writing can be washed out when the boy learns that part of the verses by heart, then gets the next lesson to be written on this slate. Each learner will always keep one slate, which is crafted by the Somalis." So just to give you a sense, as I say, we created 7 of these draft digital stories, and the idea was to basically draft these stories largely kind of to serve as a starter in a conversation about what the end product would look like, and to involve Sito and Saeed in crafting, many, many more stories, probably about 15 to 17 of them. Well, at that point, our implementation grant, we canceled our exhibition, the Arts of African Islam, and so the implementation grant funds that we were relying upon to kind of take this next phase, we had to return essentially. So we couldn't actually compensate Sito and Saeed for the time that they would take on this project. So we felt at that point we better just kind of put a hold on it. The next phase was, as I mentioned before, with the Somali Museum of Minnesota. And this was a way not necessarily of reinvigorating the first phase, but a way of kind of taking what we had learned and produce outcomes that seemed more manageable. And so here the idea was to recognize what resources each partner brought to the table. In our case, we have great studio photography skill sets, videography skill sets, as well as the equipment and the staff. And the Somali Museum of Minnesota had a great permanent collection of Somali artworks, as well as strong connections to the larger Somali American community in the Twin Cities. And so we could offer, for example, documentation of their permanent collection with really high resolution studio photography, as well as videography services, and they recruited Somali elders and other practitioners to kind of talk about Somali cultural heritage on camera. We got amazing footage. We got really great footage, and all the interviews are in Somali. And that actually is kind of where things got a little tripped up for us, because at that point we kind of maxed out what we could commit to in terms of our staff time. And the Somali Museum of Minnesota didn't have video editing skill sets among their employees, so we kind of had literally a language barrier that we had to work through. Realizing that, the next step for us was to basically write a grant proposal to fund a Somali language speaking video editor who could then take the raw footage and edit them into shorter video pieces that could appear on both of our websites. And unfortunately, we didn't get that grant. And we'll talk kind of what we learned from those experiences in a second. I think just to start that conversation, we wanted to kind of pull back and look at kind of a bigger picture in terms of who our partners were and how we engaged them on an organizational level, which is to say kind of in our day-to-day operations. We're talking about our Somali community partners, the honest truth is we don't engage them that much, and hence our relationship strength is quite low. Whereas with the Buddhism project, the people who, as Gretchen said, the people who we were reaching out to are people who've kind of already opted into the life of the museum. They are members, they are followers on Facebook and other social media channels. They're people who've already kind of raised their hands. So high engagement level and high relationship strength.
So then when thinking about the actual project and what's required to ensure the success of that project, you really have to kind of think about, so if the relationship strength is really low, as in the case for the Somali digital exhibition, what would then be required by MIA would be much higher engagement level to ensure that that was a successful project. And in the case of the Buddhism exhibition, we had quite a high relationship strength in terms of people who had already opted in, they were members, they were followers. And so the amount of sort of support we needed to provide or hand-holding or connection points was much lower. So we were able to be a little bit more hands-off, have a much lighter touch, because we already had such a sort of strong relationship with those contributors. So what does this tell us? I think we've learned a lot along the way of these totally, kind of different projects, but one was that it really requires a project champion or a dedicated staff person to ensure the success of a project. So in the case of Buddhism, it really required a technology expert, not necessarily because the tool Harkin was so sort of complicated, but it did require, setting up web pages to host the Curiosity module that they call it, which was an embedded sort of module that would allow folks to ask questions. It required also really, close connection with our social media teams, and that was a strong relationship we had already forged. Also understanding what skills or relationships are required by that champion or leader. So in our case with the Somali exhibition, again, we mentioned that language barrier and skill set in terms of video production was a barrier for this project. So ensuring that the right people are sort of on the team and dedicated to pushing something forward, really important.
I just want to acknowledge that we're at time, so we beg your indulgence. We'll wrap up quickly, and if you do have questions, we can take them outside of the room maybe to let the next group in. So building on Gretchen's point, frankly, organizations demonstrate their commitments to their communities through how they budget, right? And so this is kind of key, ensuring that the funding approach that you're taking is compatible with the partnership's strengths and objectives. Grant funding often is meant for things with discrete and definable timelines and a discrete and definable end product. Relationships don't always work that way. And especially if you're building a relationship, look to other funding sources. Look to discretionary funds. Look to existing roles at the museum that are funded through the general operating budget, not through grant funds. Think about existing programs and how they can be leveraged. In other words, try to not peg your relationship building to a kind of a granting cycle, because it certainly didn't work in the case of our Somali partners. And then equally, don't place such an emphasis on product. Process is really important too. From the perspective of MIA, perhaps we didn't meet our objectives, but I think if one were to ask our other partners, you might get a different answer. I mean, the reality is that there were true tangible benefits that came out of these processes that have benefited all of us, from the perspective of asset creation to just overall kind of recording of knowledge. All those transcribed interviews, they're still there. They'll still be resources. All those digital images, they're still there. They'll be great resources. In fact, I know the Somali Museum of Minnesota is using them for publications. The students, received credit towards their degrees. So there were clear benefits for everybody involved. And I think it's just important to, when you're making the case for partnerships, to think along those lines as well.
And then understanding the best way that you want to engage with that partner. Again, thinking about what that partner's interest level and capacity for engagement is, and then ensuring that your collaborators' expectations align with your own. I think those things were really important. Again, emphasizing the fact that where are the relationships, have they already been forged, and then therefore what does that engagement need to look like, what is required to ensure its success.
And then finally, think hard about digital, right? I mean, technology can be a doorway, but it can also be an obstacle, and just ensure that an emphasis on digital doesn't create an imbalance that can't be addressed. Strong partnerships rely on complementary resources, including skill sets and knowledge bases, and think about how digital falls into that. As is often the case, well-funded museums with digital capacity will by default be the caretakers of whatever those projects wind up being if they're digital. So think about that. Understand that's going to be your role to maintain, to support, host, and maintain those digital resources well after the partnership period kind of ends, if there's a discrete ending to it. Those are our thoughts. If you have any questions, would love to take them. Oh, thank you. That's how you can reach us via email. Thank you so much for coming.